In 1750, two things of note happened. The first was that Jack Broughton lost the title to the upstart Jack Slack. The second we'll come to later. For 10 years, the deeply unpopular Slack robbed the fancy of any of their joy of boxing and developed a reputation for fixing fights. When he eventually had the title taken from him by Bill Stevens some 10 years down the line, the noble science was in a sorry state. For the next 22 years, the title passed back and forth. A procession of champions, each more dishonest than the last, claimed the laurels. Meggs, Milsom, Ducow, Darts, Lyons and Corcoran all took their turn. The title was bought and sold, fixed fights were common, and had it not been for one man, boxing may have passed out of the national consciousness altogether. The second thing of note that happened in 1750 was that a boy by the name of Thomas Jackling was born in Derby. The quiet and peaceful boy grew into a thoughtful and strong but gentle man. He didn't have any real desire to fight, but one day in 1783, after moving to London for work, he found himself on the receiving end of a challenge from a wagon driver he'd accidentally slighted. Jackling was not a fighter. He worked as a corn porter on Old Swan Stairs, and when one of his fellows became ill, he simply did his work too, carrying double loads until his comrade was well enough to come back to work. But no apology would do. Jarvis the cartman was an experienced pugilist, and was fully confident in his ability to punish the northern lout. They met at Locks Fields in Southwark, and Jackling, who had never fought before, discovered a natural talent for violence. He was unfeasibly strong, and in the space of just a few minutes beat Jarvis bloody. This brought his name to the attention of the boxing community, and very quickly he was challenged once again, this time by a professional fighter who went by the name of the Croydon Drover. This challenge too he accepted, with slightly less hesitancy than the first, for this time he was being paid. In less than half an hour, he racked up his second win. At this point he decided to move away from the life of a porter and turn professional, and he adopted the more conventional southern version of his name, Tom Johnson. Johnson's next challenger was the famous Stephen Oliver, who had been fighting for several decades under the name of Death. He lasted 18 minutes. Bill Love lasted 5 minutes, Jack Towers not much more. A large, strong fighter by the name of Fry survived nearly half an hour, but it was beginning to look very much as if there was no one who could stand against the quiet, honest northerner. Suddenly, the fancy were on fire with the idea of this new prospect. He was popular, skilled, and utterly honest through and through. There was no question of him agreeing to lose, and very little prospect of it happening honestly. The quest was on to find someone to stand against him. On the 18th of January 1787, William Waugh stepped into the ring against Johnson for the price of 200 guineas. Almost immediately, Waugh found himself completely outclassed and proceeded to throw himself to the ground again and again to attempt to prevent the absolute mauling he would otherwise receive. It didn't work, and in just under an hour, Tom Johnson was declared the winner and proclaimed himself champion of all England. In December of the same year, he faced Michael Ryan, the Irish champion, and was attended by none other than Richard Humphreys and Daniel Mendoza, whose day was yet to come. The pair faced off in the ring. Ryan was the favourite to win, having so much more experience, and that was shown to be accurate for the first 20 minutes of the fight, at which point Ryan caught Johnson with such a solid blow that he was out on his feet, hands hanging low by his sides, swaying gently from side to side. But before he could fall to the ground, Ryan hit him again. Humphreys, seeing this as unsporting, ran into the ring, grabbed Ryan and cried foul. Immediately a huge clamour broke out, with Ryan turning on his own second, claiming that he'd failed in his duty to stop Humphreys from spoiling the fight. By the time everything had settled down, Johnson had recovered, and as none could agree who'd been more at fault, the fight was restarted. Ryan's heart was no longer in it, and Johnson finished his man in less than 10 minutes. All agreed that the fight had not been won cleanly, and so a rematch was agreed. The pair met again in Rickmansworth in Hertfordshire on February the 11th, 1789. The second battle was considered by many to be one of the finest ever witnessed. Both fighters displaying great science, moving around the ring, parrying, feinting and striking with precision, but in the end Johnson's cool demeanour won out over Ryan's passion, and 33 minutes after the start, the Irishman surrendered. Johnson again attempted to claim the title, but the fancy weren't going to give up on the renewed passion for boxing that was once again sweeping the country and put one more obstacle in his path: Big Ben Brain. The match was made for £1,000, but Ben was taken ill shortly before and was forced to forfeit. It seemed there was no one willing and able to face Johnson in the ring, and more of the influential men of the fancy looked to approve his claim. But in Birmingham, one man had other ideas. Isaac Perrins stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed close on 17 stone, around 240 pounds or 110 kilos, and he was famously strong. He'd beaten everyone of note in the Midlands and was now looking to make his claim on the scene in London. Johnson was 5 inches shorter and 40 pounds lighter, but feared no one, and so the date was set. At 1 o'clock on October the 22nd, 1789, the two met in a raised turf ring in Banbury, Oxfordshire. Regulars of the fight scene had become used to seeing Johnson as the larger man with an impressive physique, but when stood next to Perrins, he looked like nothing more than a child. The fight began, as you may expect, with Perrins taking the initiative and Johnson using his smaller size and faster movement to stay clear of the big man. 5 minutes in, after nothing of note had landed, Perrins made a desperate lunge forward, which, had it landed, would have floored a bull. But Johnson was too smart and caught the big man clean with a perfectly timed cross-counter, and he dropped. The next 3 rounds went much the same way, with Johnson's science leading the day, but Perrins was no fool, and seeing that outfighting was a losing game, switched to wrestling. He threw Tom to the ground. He repeated this tactic for several more rounds, and the fight degenerated into a game of cat and mouse, with Perrins taking every opportunity to close, and Johnson doing little more than run away. All present began to suspect that Perrins would carry the day, but Johnson was no fool and could see that despite his great strength, his impressive science, and unmatched bottom, Perrins' wind was beginning to fade. Perrins, too, felt it and started to mock Tom openly. "Is this the valiant Johnson, champion of all England?" he called, and his words found their mark. "By God, you shall soon know Tom Johnson is here," the champion replied, and leapt in with a right to Perrins' brow, closing his left eye in an instant, but Perrins didn't fall, and caught Johnson in return. The fight was 40 rounds in, and was now on in earnest. Johnson caught Perrins right on the button and opened his nose completely, blood flowing freely, but even this didn't stop him. Perrins carried on moving forwards. But he was slowing, and Johnson, in a moment of cunning, started to use a new tactic. He allowed Perrins to close, and using his speed caught him with a solid blow, but before the larger man had chance to wrestle with him, he dropped to one knee. Perrins' second immediately called foul and claimed the win, but after a brief consultation the umpires allowed it. There was no mention of deliberate falling in the articles of the fight. This marked the turning point, as both men knew now that Perrins' one advantage was gone, and he began to fade. Johnson blocked and evaded blow after blow, his strength seemingly growing as fast as the bigger man's was fading. But despite being hit seemingly at will and repeatedly falling from exhaustion, Perrins would not surrender. After an hour and a quarter and 62 rounds of fighting, Isaac Perrins was bodily dragged from the stage by his own supporters. Perrins never fought again, but took the money he'd earned and set himself up as a publican in Manchester, where he died in 1800 rescuing 3 people from a house fire. Johnson, on the other hand, was now truly champion and a rich man. But in the space of 2 years he'd spent all of his winnings, of which there were many thousands of pounds, and he'd developed a habit of drinking and gambling. In 1791, with no choice left to him, he agreed once again to face Big Ben Brain. But this time, it was a different Johnson who took to the ring. After 18 minutes and 21 rounds, Tom Johnson had lost. He never recovered either physically or emotionally from the loss to Brain. He became landlord of the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Marylebone, but drank heavily and gambled. He lost his licence and moved to Ireland, where he soon died, aged only 47. Fighting took everything from Tom Johnson, but in return, he gave the sport back the legitimacy it so desperately needed. And he's gone down in history as the man who saved boxing.